Hi, I'm Jaymie.
And I'm Stacey.
And this is the BodySmartPodcast.
And today we have with us Sarah Dosanje, an accredited psychotherapist who specialises in binge eating recovery and how to make peace with food and find a better relationship with food. Sarah's got a YouTube channel. She has her own podcast, Life After Diets. And she's also written a book which was a bestseller on Amazon, which is I Can't Stop Eating. I think many of our listeners can probably resonate with that title. I've definitely been there. But what we wanted to really start with is defining binge eating, because I think many people kind of label themselves or label their behaviours as, oh yeah, I always binge on a Friday. And obviously you're in the perfect position to explain to us, you know, what is a binge, and then where's the line when that might become disordered eating and become potentially binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm. Well, firstly, nobody owns language. So sometimes people say, oh, that's not really a binge, or that's not really a binge. So it's probably helpful to just draw the line between like clinically defined binge eating and how we just might use it colloquially as well. So in order for it to come sort of within the disordered eating disorder category, it's eating an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in similar circumstances. Well, there's your first problem, because who gets to define what's definitely larger in most circumstances? And that it's accompanied by a sense that you've completely lost control, and usually within a shorter period of time. So an example I've given about 2 hours. And it's got to be accompanied by distress, guilt, shame, secrecy. There's so many other little subcategories that can add evidence to this coming under binge eating. How people are using it every day is just they feel like they've eaten a lot of food, or they've eaten more than they wanted to. And so you could say objective and subjective binging, but even for someone who will say, like, having a big bar of chocolate is a binge, that could be just as distressing to them, to that person, than someone who's having something that everyone would agree is like a clinically large amount of food. So, like anything,
it's relative.
It's so subjective though, because some people could genuinely eat like a whole Domino's pizza and a bar of chocolate and be totally fine with it, and be like, yeah, okay, maybe that's a normal amount of food.
Yeah. And if there isn't distress, it doesn't come under binge eating.
So
everyone wants to... Sorry, go on.
No, so what about like if you've got those like highly palatable foods like Oreos or something, and you know, some people could go like, they could feel a bit distressed, have an Oreo or two, and then nail the whole packet, and then feel guilt and shame that they've nailed the whole packet, but was like a little bit stressed in the moment, and the food's highly palatable, made by design, and you just woof the whole packet backwards. Yeah. You know, it's like...
This is where it gets complicated, right? Because there are certain foods that are kind of, they're engineered to make us want to eat more of them. And we do feel less satiated by them. We'll eat more. And I guess it really comes down to how distressing it is. So generally, the way I kind of bring the difference between disordered eating and how, I don't know, the average Joe just might struggle with regulating their food intake is that with disordered eating, it seems like the harder you try to stop, the worse it gets. That's the experience. Like, it's not about not wanting it enough. This is something they're thinking about all the time. I once saw a meme on social media, and I wouldn't suggest that everyone gets their information off of memes on social media, but it's a really good one. And it says how people who struggle with binge eating, people who don't struggle with binge eating don't really think about food unless they're eating. The people who do struggle with disordered eating or binge eating think about food all the time unless they're eating. Because most of the time it's that switching off. That, I think, is what really defines a binge, is that you feel like you couldn't stop even if you really wanted to.
That's really interesting, because I feel like I've got a lot of clients who would say they spend a lot of their time thinking about food, but definitely wouldn't identify as having disordered eating. So again, it's so subjective, isn't it? And I've been through phases of my life where I can't stop thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, and like not in a disordered way, just I'm going to look forward to cooking a really nice recipe, and then I'm going to have some wine, and you know, you can be thinking about food a lot and it not be an issue.
Well, there's no distress there.
I see.
I think that's a big part. Is there's the distress, there's the obsession, there's often anxiety, there's fear, there's guilt and shame. We've got to throw all of that into the mix as well, I think.
Okay.
See, with our clients, because they're specifically trying to lose weight and then learn how to get to that weight maintenance and sustain the results, when you are often going through a calorie or an energy deficit, you know, you are consuming fewer calories a day than your body burns, so you are in that. Will have times where you will be hungry, and that can obviously also lead to just thinking about food all the time. I know if I ever like quote unquote tell myself I'm on a diet, I'm going to lose a little bit of weight, it's my like sort of brain switches on. It's like everything's scarce.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, and I do start thinking about food a lot more.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just psychologically telling myself I'm not satiated, even though normally I could eat the same food sometimes and feel fine.
Well, that's quite natural. And I think the other bedrock of disordered eating is how you're eating or how you're not eating defines how you feel about yourself. That's where it comes in, like your whole identity and your sense of self-worth becomes on, am I on track? Am I off track? Am I being good? Am I being bad with my food? That, I think, is where it really takes over someone's life and takes over their whole identity and sense of self. Then
That's
you're in
definitely something that we're really big on. I used to have to tell you off all the time for saying on track and off track, because I'd be like, there is no track. You're off track. But it's definitely a big kind of mindset shift that we try and embody in our clients, that your morality around food is in your head. Like, there is no good food, there is no bad food. You haven't like ruined your day if you ate a certain food or eat a certain amount of a food. So I definitely think that plays a big part in kind of disconnecting yourself from the food and its power over you.
Yeah. I also think those of you that work in the fitness world, you see this first before it gets to a therapist. So I think it's like you guys are on the front line. So if you can help your clients instill like a really healthy attitude towards food, hopefully they won't end up needing to see me.
Yeah.
So that definitely leads me on to this, because, and this is just anecdotal, means just my own personal, look at me trying to use words. My own experience with coaching like lots of clients is some people who have had patterns of disordered eating, or at least a lot of the women that I've seen who have ended up having full-blown eating disorders, it's stemmed from almost some trauma that's happened to them in their past, or something that's happened to them in their childhood. Not always, but like sometimes that can be. There's obviously other things around societal norms and social media, and it's a whole Pandora's box in terms of opening that up. But is there a typical pattern that can lead someone to start having patterns of disordered eating or an eating disorder?
So I don't like to put categories to define, but generally speaking, people go one way or another. So their disordered eating can be an actual result of restriction, from dieting, from all the guilt and not allowing themselves to have the foods that they want. And for those people, they think that binge eating and compulsive eating is their problem, but it's not. For these people, when they stop restricting, their eating kind of regulates out. And then you'll get other people for whom food became a way to cope or to manage with emotions. And that happened usually quite young. So if you think about it, if you're a kid and you're going through stuff, you're not understanding what's going on around you. And we know that kids tend to blame themselves. All kinds of things are going on. You don't know what that is. You can't even name your own feelings. What's most available for most kids? It's usually food. They're not going to pick up alcohol. They're not likely to pick up drugs. But we know that food, it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. It allows us to feel really calm. So therefore, it can work actually quite well in emotional regulation. So I think for some people, it comes in through that path. And they're normally trying to diet as well, and it becomes more complicated for them because they've got all the emotional stuff going on and potentially having binge eating urges coming as a result of restriction and not eating enough as well. So then we have to adjust the restriction first, and then we can see what's left.
Yeah. And we definitely see that like so much, is like so many of the clients have got really strong beliefs because of the media and social media and the diets and diet culture that's gone on for decades, that there is this belief that you have to almost like really struggle to just eat well or to eat healthy. It should be painful or not enjoyable to an extent. So when you actually just give someone a little bit more of an abundant mindset around food, they actually like, oh, I can have this, but just in moderation, or I can, and it's just like, oh, like I'm choosing to have the chocolate instead of like, I can't have the chocolate or the cookie, and I put my hand in the cookie jar and it's like, now I just need to eat all the cookies in case I never have them again.
Yeah.
It does start to really, open up the doors for people to take, healthier steps with their relationship with food.
Well, have you guys heard the expression Last Supper eating? Have you heard this expression?
Not the expression, but I can imagine.
You can probably guess where I'm going with this.
I'm going to start a diet on Monday, so I'm going to empty my cupboards of everything delicious first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're going to eat even more than you normally would leading up to that. And it might even be tomorrow that it's going to start. And then that day comes and you don't manage to reach these high expectations you set for yourself. And the minute it wobbles a bit, it's like, oh, well, today's a write-off. I'll start tomorrow. Last Supper eating starts again. So some people get stuck in this Last Supper eating cycle on an almost daily basis.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who are saying, I'm not restricting, but they're always planning to as well.
Yeah.
And our brain anticipates, our bodies anticipate as well. And that can have a rebound thing. That was life-changing for me, actually, realising that.
Was that in your own personal experience, you mean?
Yeah, so my story gets a little bit more, I think it's more atypical. So I have a tumour on my pituitary gland, so my hormones they're all too low. So I'm on a wide range of hormone replacements. And that sent my eating haywire when that first happened. And before I was on any replacements, I was hungry all the time. I'd get up in the middle of the night and I would eat. I just was constantly hungry and constantly full. And I thought I was losing my mind. And then when I discovered the hormonal problem, when we replaced the hormones, that seemed to like level out the primal hunger, but I was still struggling with food and I was still stuck in this cycle of Last Supper eating as well. And whilst my eating was probably only haywire from the hormones, maybe for about 18 months, it took a long time. It took years to get back into a healthy place with food because it really did a number on me. There's stuff like it gets in the nervous system, almost like how you feel around food. It's so primal that once that system becomes dysregulated in some way, whether it's emotionally, psychologically or physically, then there's work to be done to try and get it into a place of sort of homeostasis.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you touched on the hormones, because something that you'd mentioned in your email was, I want to challenge the fact that it's always about this restriction cycle and there are other factors. So hormones is obviously one that you've personally experienced. Can you explain how those hormones work?
Well, this is the thing about the appetite. It's such a complex system. You can put almost any of the major hormones into Google and say, does this hormone impact appetite, whether it's estrogen, testosterone, thyroid hormones? And the answer is always yes, in some way. So these are all kind of acting sort of partially on their own and interact with one another. We don't understand this whole system very well. We just know that all these different hormones seem to be part of this very kind of unique ecosystem, if you like, that we've got in our body, and it just takes one to be out of whack. So we know with PCOS, for example, people often experience stronger cravings for carbohydrates. People who menstruate, like at certain points in their cycle, their appetite, because estrogen is a appetite suppressant. When estrogen's higher, your appetite's lower. So you end up with these fluctuations, and then when women go into menopause and their estrogen drops, that also impacts it. Not to mention, they're then trying to control their eating. So you've got the hormonal thing going on. You've got this over control because they're not working with their biology. They're trying to work against it. And that is like this perfect storm for like big episodes of compulsive eating.
Yeah, it's something we touch on a lot because people always get quite upset when they're like, oh, it's my hormones that have just caused me to gain a lot of weight. And it's like, well, not directly, like they are influencing your behavior, and then your behavior is leading often to a huge excess consumption of calories because of the way you're feeling in that, in those moments. And then that's what's causing it's the excess consumption of calories, but it is the hormones that are indirectly / directly having an impact on that, which is, I've said it forever, like hormones rule the world. They really do. They control how you think, feel and act. And that is going to have a huge influence on your behavior.
And vice versa. How we think and act can affect our hormones as well. So you've probably heard it's done the rounds a lot, the milkshake study. Do you know this one?
I have not, no.
Okay, it's Polivy, I don't know how you say it, and Herman. I think it was in the 70s, I think it's in Canada. They got their participants and like half of them were given this sort of low-calorie milkshake, and they had blood tests, their ghrelin levels were measured and they were told it was low-calorie, etc.
Just to clarify for the audience, the ghrelin is one of your appetite regulating hormones.
Yes, it's one of your hunger hormones. It's the one produced in the stomach area. And then they had a group of people who thought they were having something low calorie and it was higher calorie, and another group who was having a higher calorie milkshake and they thought it was lower calorie. And the ghrelin was responding to what people were anticipating. So if you think that you are consuming more calories, that can cause your stomach to produce more ghrelin in anticipation of having it.
Wow.
So this is what I think might be happening before a binge for some people. They start planning that they're going to binge. Their ghrelin levels start rising. There's that feeling of inevitability, like your biology is getting ready to eat. And that is really hard to just put the brakes on and put that full stop in once your biology is like gearing up for that. So, like I said, it's such a complex system. We still don't know enough about it.
I mean, the mind is so powerful, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like we're the only mammals that could sit here now and have a conversation and laugh, cry, get angry, just go take ourselves through so many different emotions just through thought and talking alone. It is crazy, but I think you see it in so many different things. Like different people can be sat there and just be completely stressed and holding on to so much tension in every part of their body just through their own thoughts alone or what they're currently sort of experiencing. It's extremely powerful.
Yeah. which is why I take the approach that I do, because so often people don't know what's going on in their bodies. And most GPs are not going to give you a full blood work just because you want to know what's going on in there. It's not as easy as that. So it's like, well, let's start with the psychology. Let's start with the emotions. Let's see how much we can do there first.
So where would you typically start?
For me, I think one of the biggest blocks for people with changing this stuff is the shame. So this is what tends to happen. It's like, you'll see this in your clients, like how many times, or you may have done it yourself, that you swear to yourself, like, I am going to do it differently from now on. Like, from tomorrow, this is how I'm going to eat, this is how I'm going to behave, whether it's with food or whatever it is. And you swear blind to yourself is what you're going to do. And then you don't. And then you promise you will again, and then you don't. And so the brain's going like, why aren't we doing this thing that means so much to us? So the only conclusion it comes to, well, there's something wrong with me. Like, I must be completely broken in some way. And so that story gets activated over and over again. When we believe we're broken, when we believe we're useless, when we believe there's something wrong with us, then our behavior reflects that as well. So people end up in this stuck cycle. So we have to, I believe, reduce the shame first, that battling with ourselves, reducing inner conflict, because conflict is so uncomfortable. And I think that's partly why people go unconscious when they binge, because part of them wants to binge. And part of them doesn't. Part of them is like, you're going to regret this later. It is so uncomfortable to stay in that place of conflict. So we switch off. So I think it starts, this, I know I sound like such a therapist when I say this, but I think it starts with like our relationship with ourselves, because self-compassion and connection, I say that's the antidote to something like shame. So realizing that you're not alone. Being in community with other people who get it. We all have that desire to be understood. So if you're somewhere where you feel understood and you feel accepted, like that releases some of the shame. And also, if somebody's really in that shame and that guilt place, all the emotions are running, like heightened emotions, they're catastrophizing, all of this. The limbic brain is extremely stimulated. And you see it even in like MRI scans, or when it's MRI or a different brain scan, where the blood flow moves away from the prefrontal cortex into the limbic brain.
So your prefrontal cortex is your like thinking,
Yes.
rational 21st century brain.
Yes.
And we're talking now like prehistoric, impulsive brain.
Exactly. So now your emotions are running the show. What's also in your limbic brain as well? Your appetite. So all of that's disrupted. But if we bring in the self-compassion, what self-compassion does is it calms down emotional reactivity.
Yeah.
If we can calm down emotional reactivity, we can think clearer. When we can think clearer, we feel like we're more ourselves. We're in the executive seat. We can make decisions that feel like free decisions.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think of like being in our client seats and being like, okay, so this is me. I'm going through that cycle every week. I say I'll start on Monday, or say I'll start tomorrow, and it keep happening. I end up in that cycle of like, why can't I keep my promises to myself? Am I not good enough? Do I not deserve it? And then I just keep ending up in the same pattern, and it just keeps happening. And then to start with, like, well, I need to stop shaming myself. Like how? Because that just sounds like a lot easier said than done in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And that's why I think when you understand more about what's going on, when you understand that this is a very primal system that's become dysregulated, and it's learn how to override your conscious control. And you don't understand why. But when you understand that it's happened to other people as well, and when you can feel that compassion for other people start to act as a bit of a mirror for yourself. But often it comes down to the all or nothing thinking as well, which I guess you see with your clients as well, these expectations that they have of themselves.
Yeah.
Is not realistic. You've been struggling with food. Some people come to me, they've been struggling with food for decades. And they're still telling themselves that on Monday morning, everything's going to be different.
Yeah. And actually, a big part of how we break that down is, right, Monday morning, you're not going to start going to the gym 5 times and only eating 1,200 calories and not touching anything that's in a packet. Do you know what we're going to start with? Going for a walk. Full stop. Nothing else. Because it is that, like, unrealistic expectation and not meeting it, and an unrealistic expectation and not meeting it that's creating the cycle. So it's changing the expectation sometimes that really is needed to break that cycle. And then, I have kept that promise to myself. I went for a walk. All right, tomorrow I'll go for a walk and drink 2 litres of water. Okay, the next day then I will eat 5 vegetables and do those other things. And layering it on in a way that feels like I can actually keep promises to myself.
Yeah, it starts with building up that confidence. I had the story for the longest time that I was inconsistent. I never stuck at anything I did. And the first thing I stuck at was actually yoga. And it started off with just 5 minutes a day before I went to bed. And I probably did 5 minutes a day for probably over 2 years before it grew into something else.
That's really impressive.
Yeah, definitely.
And the only thing I had to do was actually step on the mat. So even if I was ill, even if I went out and it was 2:00 in the morning when I came in, I would get on that mat. And even if I just sat there for a couple of minutes, like, it was done. And it created a little bit of momentum.
But I hate because you set expectations that were realistic and manageable even on your worst day, which is key. So you said to yourself, the bar isn't a 30-minute practice. The bar is getting on my mat.
And people still struggle with that, though, because it doesn't feel like enough.
Yeah.
A lot of the time,
especially
as well.
for type A type personalities, which we get a lot of body smart clients, you know, that they're like, I achieve everything in every other part of my life. Why am I not doing this? And they want to set that bar high.
It stems back though, doesn't it? Like when you're in, you know, when you're a kid and when you're in school, the bar is always, well, if you get an A+, or if you get 100%, like, you're really good. So it's rewarded quite a lot to be a perfectionist, to have that all or nothing sort of mentality. But then when it comes to parts of like your health and wellness and your training and your exercise and you know, your nutrition, I say this every time I speak to clients. It's, if we were doing a 28-day challenge, you know, I could go to you, right, here's a diet plan. We're going to do 10,000 steps. We're going to work out 5 times a week. We're going to drink all the water. We're going to do all the things. And you could just like buckle down and get it done for 28 days. But it's like your health and wellness and your fitness and your diet is a lifelong journey. And we cannot keep that like 100% mentality forever. Like, you might be able to do it for a challenge or for a set period of time. But you, for the natural like ebbs and flows of life and the seasons that we go through, you have to have more of that adaptable mentality to be like, hey, some days 60%, some days 20%, some days 80, some days 100, you know, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, some days you've only got 60%. So if you give 60%, you've given 100%, really.
Yeah.
Think about it. But, excuse me. I don't know if you're Friends fans or if you've seen any of the Friends episodes.
Yeah.
Do you know the one with Monica's closet? Where, you know, how Monica is, everything is like pristine and in place, but she's got this closet, which is just an absolute tip. And that's often how it is. When you were describing those type A personalities, you will say like, I'm so disciplined in other areas of my life and I achieve the things that I want to achieve. Why can't I do this? And it's almost like it becomes the one area where all the mess goes, all the mess gets stuck. Because as I'm sure you guys know, there is no perfect diet. There is no perfect relationship with food. So one of the things that I do as a therapist is we look at someone's patterns in all areas of their life and how are they playing out that pattern with food. And sometimes people need to let go a bit more and have a bit more freedom in other areas of life so that food doesn't become the only place where they exercise that freedom.
Yeah. I think something that's really interesting that you said was about all the mess happens because there is no perfect diet. And yet so many people come to us and say, I just want someone to tell me what I should eat.
They want a meal plan.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the best way is for you to figure out your perfect diet for your body through trial and error. And a lot of people don't want to do that.
They don't. It's because it's the work, isn't it? It's putting in the work. Like, following a meal plan is very prescriptive. Like, oh, here you go. This will fix my problems. But it doesn't educate you. It doesn't teach you to become self-aware. It doesn't allow you to, like, we've all got different palates. Like, what I like to eat and you and everyone else will be different.
Yeah, apparently mine's dead weird.
Your palate is dead weird. Yeah. So yeah, it's the work, isn't it? I think that's what it comes down to. Is like, you are going to have to put in some sets of reps. For me, with nutrition, though, is that food is something that you are going to eat till the day you die. It's like, there's not, you know, there's certain things that you might not be doing every single day forever. So I'm like, surely, like, it makes sense. Like, that's how I try and frame it. It makes sense to put in the time to become more self-aware, to educate yourself about nutrition. So you actually have this in a more manageable place where food isn't consuming your thoughts all the time. You always don't feel like stuck or unsure what to do, or diet starts on Monday, because that cycle is just, it's draining. It's so emotionally, mentally draining. It takes up so much headspace. So to get that in a place where it's actually like, it actually feels pretty easy now. I understand it. Like, I can eat out without like stressing out every time. And, you know, I feel good about myself. You feel in control. I think that's a really powerful place to get to. And it's like, it's not unachievable. And I think that's women who have struggled for, you know, years or decades, they feel like that's unachievable because the story for the past couple of years or past couple of decades has been, I can't do this. So it's not until you start to build some of that evidence that says otherwise, your beliefs really don't change.
I think as well, there's a group of people, and I'm wondering if you might fall into this category, who I call like the rational behaviorists, right? If something just rationally makes sense and they can see a way to do it, it's like, well, I'll just do the thing because it makes sense to do the thing. And then there's the rest of us who are more like complex thinkers and feelers, which is not to simplify the rational behaviorists at all, but it's like we're much more conflicted, and sometimes something can make the most sense to us and we still feel completely stuck. And I think about this in terms of like parts work. When you think about it, when you said people come to you and they want a food plan, it's like, because they say they just want to be told what to eat. That feels great until it doesn't.
And then you don't eat what was on the plan, and then you beat yourself up like crazy because you didn't eat the thing on the plan.
And then what happens is the swing into chaos.
Yeah.
But when you're in chaos, when you're first in control, even if you're following something really prescriptive, oh, well, this feels like freedom. I'm not binging all the time. This feels great. And then at some point that feels confining, and the part that wants to break free breaks out as well. So again, like when I work with this, it's listening to the parts of us that don't seem to be rational. Because for a lot of these people, like this stuff happened in childhood. There was judgment in childhood. They still hear that voice in their head that tells them that no matter what you're saying to them about like all these things, they go, yeah, that makes sense. But in a moment, it's that old stuff, those old circuits that get activated as well.
Well, it's that other part of your brain as well, isn't it? Especially in a stressful situation where you then switch off your prefrontal cortex and it's not that part of your brain that's driving everything.
Yeah. A story that I've heard quite a few times, probably like a few dozen times actually, is somebody who, when they were a kid, they were perhaps considered chubby or overweight as a kid. And so their parents put them on a diet. And so that's where secret eating then starts, because they're kids and they're hungry. So now all the shame and the guilt builds up around it. And now later on, their parents might have zero influence. And maybe they're living in a bigger body and they'll say things to me like, you know, I don't like my body. I wish I was in a smaller body. But like there's this really weird part of me that goes, but if I do that, they win. Right? That doesn't make any rational sense, because we have these parts of us that aren't rational for many of us. Like when we're younger, there's stuff that happens to us. And so it's not until we can make that conscious that we can do anything with it, because the stuff that I think that's outside of our awareness is the stuff that trips us up the most. Once we're aware of it, we stand a bit more of a fighting chance of doing something about it.
And then you can recognise it when those thoughts start to bubble up. You can be like, oh, there's that irrational thought again.
Yes.
And you can call it what it is.
Yes, you can become the watcher and go like, interesting.
Yeah. And we actually had a really interesting episode a couple of weeks ago with a trauma therapist, didn't we? And
Yes.
he was talking a lot about that, how, you know, things that have happened in childhood, you don't even realise how they impact your decisions, your behaviours now. But as soon as you make that connection, sometimes that's all you need to shift that behaviour, because you've become conscious of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes it's all you need. Sometimes people still end up stuck because there's just layers and layers to keep peeling back sometimes. If you haven't got that rational, and also I don't mean to kind of make it too binary that you've got rational behaviorists and the complex thinkers and feelers, because you could have areas of your life where you are a rational behaviorist, because there isn't a whole load of complex stuff going on. Maybe at work, like you can behave in very sort of just get done what you need to get done, even if you don't feel like doing it. But then there are those certain areas that just have more emotions, more complexity, more early stuff.
I think it's a really interesting area that you work in, though, because it can definitely be worked on. It's not something that you are a complex overthinker and that's just you now. Like, you're always going to have issues with this one thing. You can work on how you think about those things, can't you? And move into a different phase of life.
Yeah, and people will say to me, well, like, is it possible to then fully recover? Because let's say they're at a 1 and they look at 100 as some kind of idealized relationship with food where you never have a problem or stress about food. You just know what your body wants all the time. And I'll say, if you're at a 1 and that's 100, is it still worth it to get to a 68? Is it still worth it to get to an 81? Heck, is it still worth it just to get to a 34? Because this is on a scale and we can always become better, more comfortable, more peaceful, more accepting of ourselves and our relationship with food.
Yeah, it's again breaking down that all or nothing, black and white mentality, isn't it? Where we do it right, in inverted commas, or we don't, when actually there's a whole spectrum of experience there. Yeah.
And that's why I love group work. And I love the idea of communities, because if you're a black and white thinker, you don't notice it in yourself, but you can see it in other people.
That's true. That's very true.
And then it gives you information about yourself and you're like, oh, I do that.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick ask. If you are enjoying this podcast, we do ask if you would go and hit that subscribe button, because our goal is to be able to help all of you guys become body smart. And the way we can do that is by getting better guests on, more experts. And the bigger this podcast gets, the more guests we can get on here.
Yeah, we have our community calls and community groups, and I feel like a lot of clients get a benefit from that mirror kind of, what's the word?
Well, I think a lot of people believe that their problems are no one has problems like them. So when you do get in a community setting and when you start to realize, oh, this lady has the same issues as me and it sounds very similar to me, it's like it makes you realize like, oh, like there are other people, and there's seeing other people as well that are like a couple of steps ahead of you. So you're saying about that scale, you're thinking if you're like 10 and they're at like 50, but they say they were at 10, it almost gives you hope to be like, okay, so I can just keep developing these skills and taking those steps and get there as well. And it opens, I think it does take people from that very closed mindset to have a more of an open mindset, a growth mindset, to be like, okay, you know, there are steps I can keep taking. And I can maybe drop a little bit of that self-judgment that I've got.
Yeah. And vice versa as well, because it gives people that maybe they're at 34 and someone else joins and they're at 20 and they can be the one who says, oh, when that happened to me, I did this and it really helped. And that reinforces, I've actually come along a way. Like I actually am now helping someone else. So yeah, it's really powerful having that group network.
Yeah. And when you hear someone's talking about something and you think, oh gosh, that's me as well. Like you see people, their shoulders just relax, and people will always talk about how they feel lighter after the calls as well. It's like we want to create that emotional shift, which then really helps us to shift our thinking and then our behavior.
Yeah, and I think also social connection is so important to human happiness and just survival, and it's something that's really lacking from many of our lives. I know we were talking previously about working from home even. We end up sitting in a room with a screen. We don't see another real life human for sometimes days on end. And there has to be some kind of knock-on effect on that in terms of like seeking serotonin or dopamine or whatever from food potentially. Like there's so many factors that play into our relationship with food. If you can meet your emotional needs in a better way, that takes away another layer of what might be playing into your struggle with food.
Yeah, so much. I mean, when you ask people what food means to them, you just get so many answers. People say like food is love, food is connection, food is freedom, food is, it's like all these different really big existential themes we plonk on food.
Yeah.
It becomes part of it because like we have to have a relationship with food. It's a constant in our lives.
I think that has to be, you know, some of the bigger struggles that people have. And I've spoken to some people who've got really bad relationships with food and have really struggled with food for like their whole lives. And, you know, and they've talked about like, you know, if you were an alcoholic, you can stop going to the bar or stop drinking and stop being around a certain, you know, if you're a drug addict, you maybe stop taking drugs, you go into rehab. So, you know, you can kind of get away from the substance to the area where people are taking more of the substances or whatever that looks like. But with food, if you have a really tough relationship with food and struggle with food, you can't just stop eating. Like it's something that you're constantly surrounded by forever. And it's like, that's it exacerbates the struggle because it is so constant.
Yeah. So one of the themes that I work with people is around the idea of gentle negotiation, because we're always negotiating with food. We're like, okay, well, I'm going to eat at this time and now it's lunchtime. How much do I need now? What's available? What are my options? There's a conversation going on around food, like for many people a lot of the time, unless you've got like this really regimented structure around food. So we have to learn how to make decisions. So I'll break it down, and one of the ways that I'll do that sometimes with someone is I'll ask them to tell me, what do you want your relationship with food to look like? And they always fall into my trap because they'll go, well, I just don't want to be thinking about food all the time, and I don't want it to be this, and I don't want it to be that. And I said, okay, you're telling me what you don't want. What do you want your relationship with food to look like? And I get them to come up often with 3 adjectives. So it might be, so mine, for example, is balanced, regulated, and free. Those are the 3 things. If I can get those 3 things on board, I'm absolutely fine. So if I'm making a decision, it's automatic for me now, but like there was a long time, it was like, okay, what feels like the balanced, regulated, and free choice? The freedom part was really important, but also taking into account like what feels regulating for me as well.
I was about to ask them because we started with this a little bit, like, what are your definitions for those words? Because balance, can be a very... Balance can look wildly different for different people. So, like, what are your definitions of those words for you?
Yes. So for me, it's very much an all foods fit approach. I find a lot of people that come and they're adamant that they are addicted to certain kinds of foods. Often there's usually a lot of restriction around them, but then it's hard to tell if they're trying to restrict them because they're quote unquote addicted or whether it's a result of that. From what I see, I think about 90% of people, this is just me plucking numbers based on what I've seen, about 90% of people who think that they're addicted to certain types of food aren't. Like it's a lot about their relationship with those foods that can be worked on. The other 10%, I can only say I don't know. Because you'll get people who are very adamant that say you can't be addicted to something that you need to live. Why? No one's actually answered that. They just throw this around. You can't be addicted to something you need in order to live. Why not? Because anything that impacts the reward systems, even gambling, any kind of behavior, we can get into that reward loop, which can very much come into that. And this is why it ends up really complicated. But I think you asked me a different question. It was more about the definition of those words. And I really break that down for people as well. But for me, the definition of balance is, it's really important to me to be able to eat anything that I want. The only kind of conditions I put on myself is that I have to really do my utmost to enjoy it. I don't go unconscious with food anymore like I have in the past. And I find if I don't go unconscious with food, everything just kind of works itself out. I can eat food sometimes just because they taste nice and they're good. And then I can eat foods that I'm actually making decisions about because I also want to nourish my body. So that balance place for each person to actually define what that looks like and to get a feeling for what that might be, it's not a useful word for everyone.
Yeah, I think it gets thrown around a lot and can cause a lot of confusion because it's like, oh, you just need to have balance. And it's like, well, some people haven't taught themselves what balance needs to look like for them yet. You know what I mean? So sometimes you have to go through phases of maybe being slightly unbalanced to actually understand what balance looks like for you. Just understand that maybe are there certain things that trigger you or take you into like certain behaviors around food. And it's like, like for me, for example, I wouldn't have Oreos or M&Ms in the house. I can eat them, but like typically I just eat more than I would like to. So if I go out and like at the cinema, the foods I enjoy, so I still feel like I can have them, but I'm not going to have them in the house because I will probably open the packet and just eat the whole pack. And it does that unconscious sort of, and you just kind of one after the other.
And that does tie into your word of free, because that's not a free choice. If you end up eating the whole bag, it's not. In my experience, I would be like, well, that's not me making a free conscious choice. So this doesn't work for me having them in this moment.
But for other people, you could go, well, you should just be able to have balance and have that food in your house. And it's like, so then you've got one conflicting side saying you should just be able to have these foods in the house because quote unquote balance, versus like actually having those foods in my house and I know how my behavior is around them sometimes doesn't actually make me feel good and I don't actually feel the need to have them all. So it's like it is putting you in the driving seat, but it's understanding again what balance looks like for you. I've seen people do it like where they're just having a drink and it's like, oh, it's all about balance, and it's like it's a very broad statement that can be a little bit harmful and internalized from other people sometimes, of like, oh, maybe I should be able to do that even though I'm not on the same I'm at a different stage in my journey.
Well, it's a message a lot in the sort of anti-diet world where it's like you have to make peace with the food, you have to habituate them, so therefore you should have them around all the time. And if you haven't, or if you're not doing that, then you're restricting those foods. And this, I just think, is such a problematic message for so many people who are just so confused by this, and they're getting all the food in the house and they're going, but I'm still binging. So for me, when I was really working on the having permission part around food, because I had to get to that point where I felt like I had permission, I was always lucky enough that I have always lived close to a shop, a convenience store that I could just walk to within 5 minutes. And so for me, it was always like, you can go and get it whenever you want, but just go and get it. And the reason why I did that for the longest time, it's not, now it's much easier. I can have food in the house and not go to it all the time. But for a long time, it's like, if it was in the kitchen, it would be like, okay, I'll go and have it. And it would be this sort of back and forth that kind of became a little bit mindless. It kind of became a little bit compulsive. It wasn't a binge, so it didn't quite fall into that category. But neither did it feel like you were saying, like a free decision. I was actually making a decision. So I introduced what I now call the reactionary gap, where it was just like, I need just that extra little bit of effort, a couple of minutes. And I would do it. And I would go sometimes and I would get what I wanted. And particularly like in the early stages of my recovery, I can remember going into Marks and Spencer's food hall and I was in there and I can't remember, I picked something up and I was like, this isn't going to be enough. I need to buy a whole load more stuff. It was a binge urge that I was in. And I was like, okay, well, you don't know until you have this whether this is going to satisfy you. And it was a real moment of going, you can come back again. You really can. And when I had that permission, I was able to leave with the thing that I wanted. And on that occasion, like, I didn't go back again. But it was to reduce impulsivity as well, because you've got impulsivity and you've got compulsivity. And trying to distinguish between the two, I think, can be really helpful for people as well.
Could you take us back then to like, when did you first like understand that maybe you had some sort of patterns of like disordered eating? Like, when did that start for yourself?
So for me, it started so suddenly, now 15 years ago. And I can honestly pinpoint the exact week that it happened. I remember that a couple of weeks, it was the first time I'd ever lost any weight in my life. And I did Paul McKenna's hypnosis CD. It was a CD back then. And it felt really easy. And it was basically the hunger fullness diet. You know, when you're hungry, you eat a bit just till you're no longer hungry. And then you wait. And it was not enough food really to sustain overall, but it felt really easy. And then I went on an all-inclusive holiday. And that was the first time in my life where I ate and I felt full and still felt hungry. I'd never had that experience of feeling full and still wanting to eat before. So it was so sudden for me. And then I came back and just like binged for the next 9 months pretty much every day. And like, you know, I gained a lot of weight in that time as well. And then it was incredibly distressing. I thought I was losing my mind. So then
was there anything that triggered that to happen? Because you said it was like within a space of a week you went on a diet. Was it the diet that was the trigger, or was there something previously? Well,
this is the point where my hormones were out of whack, but I didn't realise. But from the amount of weight that I actually lost, was a very small amount of weight, the reaction was way disproportionate to that. So it's really quite difficult for me to be really clear about the actual trigger. It was like, okay, the first time I tried to lose weight, but the backlash was extraordinary. And then went on for a couple of years. And then when the hormone replacement came in, like the primal hunger eased off. So it's almost like I feel like I messed about with something, perhaps. I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure how it was triggered in that way. But it's unusual in that it was sudden. I mean, it was like almost like an overnight thing. And then it was the next decade of my life trying to get out of it.
Wow.
It was just, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So that happened. 9 months go on. You gain a lot of weight.
Then it tipped into bulimia. And then probably maybe 18 months or so after I'd first started binging, I came off the contraceptive pill and I didn't start menstruating. So that was the only reason I went to the GP, because I don't know what I would have gone to the GP and said. I remember having a checkup once with the nurse and telling her about this. I couldn't seem to stop eating. But at that point, I was still in the quote unquote healthy BMI range. So she was like, well, if you gain any more weight, kind of come back to me. But I never did. And I did gain a lot more from there. And yeah, so then they did a blood test, and that was when they saw something wasn't right. And then it was investigated much more thoroughly from that point.
Just to come back to that, I think it's something that a lot of people might be able to resonate with. They wouldn't know what the words were or know how to get a medical professional to take their concerns seriously, because I've certainly had experiences where I've been dismissed by medical professionals saying, oh, well, that's just being a woman. And you're like, I think it's maybe something more. And you're completely dismissed. But even though I'm a very big advocate of myself in many other situations, I'm like, okay then. And I just walk out. And I'm annoyed with myself after, but I had no idea what else to say.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be to somebody who knows there isn't something right and I do need help, but I don't know how to get it?
The NHS guidelines, the NICE guidelines, actually say that weight loss should not be a focus of binge eating recovery. It's there in black and white. And still people will go to the GP and they'll say, I'm struggling with this binge eating, and they're getting referrals to Weight Watchers and Slimming World. Because it's only been a standalone diagnosis since 2013.
Oh, really?
Wow.
So if you think if a GP's been a GP for longer than that, I mean, I don't even know how long they get in medical school and eating disorders. I understand it to be a very small amount of time. Like, they're not that aware of this.
But it is the most common eating disorder, isn't it?
Yeah.
What was it, 22%, I think?
22%,
of eating disorders is binge eating disorders.
Yeah, 19 bulimia, and I think it's 9 or 11 is anorexia.
And do people typically who start to get a binge eating disorder because of that guilt and shame do turn to like sort of purging?
Some do,
yeah,
but not all of them. I mean, that's what distinguishes the two, because they're very similar, actually, bulimia and binge eating disorder. The only difference is the compensatory behaviour with bulimia. But even exercise and fasting can be forms of purging.
Yeah.
So, you know,
I
it's
think
a grey area.
sometimes that becomes something that other people might judge you for, you know, being sick. But actually, if you were just going to the gym all the time, you might not feel there's a problem with that, because that's just getting healthy. Or, you know, my friends actually look up to me because I go to the gym 5 times a week. So it's harder to maybe identify, maybe you've got a struggle there.
Yeah, exactly. And just back to your question about how to approach the GP, is you're going to need to self-educate, because a lot of the time they're not going to know. So look up the actual definition and the guidelines. Decide for yourself, do you think this fits you? And then take them in with you. Like, put it in front of the GP and ask for what you want. Because I generally find with GPs, if you go in and you've educated and you're asking for what you want, you will get a much more favourable response than if you wait for them to try and fob you off and then you try and argue back with them, because then they have to back down. We don't want to put them in that position where their pride is hurt. You just want to go in and say,
really
I'm hearing about this is what I think. And even say, like, it says here that weight loss shouldn't be the focus, and I know that dieting has harmed me as well, so I really don't think that a referral to Weight Watchers and Slimming World. The problem is in the UK is that some areas don't have anything for binge eating disorder at all. So it is a little bit of a postcode lottery when you go.
Sorry, just to come back, because I'm genuinely curious, if you don't mind. Continuing to share. So
yes.
you had 9 months of binge eating.
Yes.
The bulimia started.
And
then how did this continue to evolve? You said it went on for 10
years. So I would say that when I started taking the various different hormone replacements, this is the really weird thing about it, because they were sort of staggered. So I started off with the HRT. When I first went on the HRT, I didn't binge for 3 weeks. And that was the first time I hadn't binged for 3 weeks since it had all started. And I genuinely thought, I'm cured. And then it seemed to come back. And I was like, what the heck? And then they gave me the thyroid hormone. And then for a couple of weeks, I didn't binge. And then... do
you think that was placebo, maybe?
Quite possibly.
Yeah, just like, I'm taking this thing. It's fixed me. And then
also, it's done something. It's like interrupted something in your body chemistry as well. Like your body chemistry is working on this cycle, and something's like a little bit different in that aspect as well. And then I actually think believe it or not, the one I think that made the most difference was the growth hormone.
Okay.
Because that impacts your digestion as well. And after I started taking the growth hormone, then it's really hard to describe, because it felt like the urges to still binge were there, and I was still struggling with binging. But it felt like it was coming from a different... It's so hard to describe now. I'm trying to remember it. What that was actually like. And during the pandemic, I went to Tenerife for 2 months, and my growth hormone got damaged. So it wasn't working properly. And I didn't realise this at the time. And I remember thinking, gosh, I really don't feel great. And I'm just craving sugar all the time. And I had a thought, gosh, this is almost like how I used to feel before I was on my hormone replacement. And then when I realised what was happened, I was like, wow. Because I really thought I'd be able to mind over matter this stuff now after so long. And I couldn't. It really sent my eating haywire for like 6 weeks or something like that. So anyway, came out of that, but the binge urges were still there, because I'd gained quite a lot of weight and I wanted to lose it. And so now I think a lot of it was being triggered by Last Supper eating, because I wasn't managing to actually restrict. That was going on as well. It got to a point, I think around 5 or 6 years in, where it really did feel like a decision, where I realised how purging was making me binge more, because I never went from... So I wasn't purging all the time. You might have to put some trigger warnings at the beginning of this episode to talk about this, but I wasn't purging all the time. So I might purge and then not purge for like 3 or 4 days or something like that. But I always noticed that when I purged, I never went from having purged into stability. It was always like I'd purge, bad day, not quite so bad day, maybe level out a bit. So I realised how disruptive it was, and I was like, wow, I genuinely think that this is making it worse. And when I realised that for myself, I made a decision not to do it anymore, and I probably did it twice more after I made that decision and stopped, because I was like, this is not worth it. It got to a point where I realised that my sanity and peace of mind was just more important than anything.
I was about to say, like, how because that's a long... we just went from 9 months to 6 years of that going on. Like, how did that affect your mental health?
Oh, it was horrendous. So I had surgery in 2010 on the pituitary tumour, just to do a biopsy that's still in there. And it was also the year my mum died. And so 2011, I would say, when everything was really at its worst. And I would have sworn to blind to you that my grief had nothing to do with the bulimia. It's only in hindsight I can look back now and actually see the emotional turmoil that I was going through and how that connected. And I didn't find out till I did my own training on eating disorders that purging actually releases endorphins. So it does have this calming effect. And when I went to India and did the yoga teacher training, they have a cleansing, did you do the Vaman Doughty?
I didn't actually, well, other people did, I didn't.
Yes.
But yeah, you probably have to explain to everyone else.
Yes, so it's supposed to cleanse, don't try this at home, folks, I don't agree with it at all, but it's supposed to cleanse the gastrointestinal tract or whatever, and you drink a whole load of warm salt water, and then you make yourself vomit. And it actually
You
says
make yourself vomit?
Yeah, or the salt water up. Because
There's
they think
many
it cleanses.
cleansing rituals.
Right.
Which
This
is
is one
just,
of.
yeah. So I didn't do it, but I did voyeuristically stand around and watch other people do it anyway. What was I saying about that?
You were explaining in the podcast episode about this, that the teacher was saying how it helps release stress and it calms your
Yes.
nervous system.
Yes.
And you were like, yeah, no shit.
Yes, exactly that. So like even in this sort of ancient practice, they recognized that this had a calming effect on the nervous system. And I didn't realize that at the time. And I really wish I had understood that at the time, because I couldn't understand why I couldn't stop purging. Because it really seems like the kind of thing that you should just be able to decide to stop. And eventually I did, but many times before then I was trying to and I just couldn't.
And it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that would be calming or
No, it doesn't. It sounds really, and it's not fun.
No.
But afterwards there is a sense of calming. There's a sense of like, oh, I've a clean slate. I've undone something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, people who've had this experience can really relate to that idea. Like I've undone something. It's a clean slate.
But then that's almost that last supper mentality, isn't it? Of giving yourself a green light again.
Yeah. It's always one more time. It's always one more time. It's
Yeah,
never planning
is
on.
tying into that addiction kind of conversation we were having earlier, whether you're addicted to sugar, whatever it is, you get that physiological response that feels good. Of course, there's a driver to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the dopamine, isn't it? It's the thought of doing it. It's the lead up to doing it. It's the chase to doing it. And then it's actually the execution of doing it. Like that's our natural sort of chase with dopamine. And a lot of times when we're thinking about like anything that we basically enjoy or think that we should or shouldn't do.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick ask. If you are enjoying today's episode, then please do give us a follow just to make sure you get every episode and we can keep cutting the BS and helping you hit your goals. So have you replaced that with something else?
It's interesting because Steph, my podcast co-host, and I, we kind of joke about it sometimes that this just often just gets like transposed onto something else when you're looking for, because it almost becomes like your mission in life is to figure out this food thing. Like it gives you a goal, it gives you something. There's this idea of salvation when you finally figure it out. I thought, gosh, if I'm not struggling with food, I'll never have a problem again. Couldn't imagine ever having an issue ever again. And so the meaning needed to transpose onto something else, and I guess it did with my work. You know, I'm chasing meaning in trying to fix myself. Realize, I don't need fixing. There's a kind of an irony of like once you kind of accept where you are, and once you can really make peace with the present moment, that compulsive urge to escape it. Because I think I was so disappointed with myself. But I wasn't the person who'd ever get an eating disorder. Like I grew up with a normal relationship with food. I felt so disappointed in myself that food, one, became a way of sort of trying to escape myself. There was also the element of the black and white thinking, the catastrophic thinking, always setting myself these goals, always feeling like I failed with these goals, and then just not feeling like I could bear being me. Those were all the things that I did a lot of work on. And as I was training to be a therapist, because when I first started training to be a therapist, I was still in my eating disorder. I didn't think I was going to work with eating disorders if I didn't manage to get through this. Being in therapy, I was never with therapists that knew anything about eating disorders. So some of the things they suggested were just actively harmful and completely inappropriate. When I was struggling with bulimia, one of my therapists told me to try the 5-2 diet. I was like, okay, thanks for that. Yeah. And I did, because I was
What
like...
did that have to do with therapy, by the way?
I have no idea. She was doing it. She thought it was great. But what it did give me, it gave me an opportunity of like listening to my own thoughts as I spent these 5 years that I was training in therapy. But I also found, like, I don't know if you've heard of Byron Katie, but her work for me, where it's about making peace with the present moment and you're questioning your thoughts, and you see how in one situation, like everything's true and not true at the same time. Doing that really helped me so much. And I cannot believe sometimes how nuanced I can be in my thinking, because I used to be so black and white. So the work of Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle's work on kind of, again, acceptance of now, here and now. I only need to look after myself in this moment. Because I'll often say that people, they struggle with binge eating, like when they're beating themselves up and shaming themselves for what they've eaten, they're trying to take responsibility for the past, and that's not in their control at all. And then they're making these grand plans for the future about how they're going to fix themselves. So now they're trying to take responsibility for the present. That's not in their control. And the one time where they could actually take, like, some autonomy.
The present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the time that they absolve themselves of it. So they're taking so much responsibility, but in the wrong place. And when I realized that in myself, I was like, oh, okay, like I only need to like look after myself in this moment and the near future. And that I think was enormously helpful for me as well.
Yeah, it sounds like, obviously you've just completed your yoga training, but it sounds like yogic kind of philosophy and that moment of being present, it's a big part in what's helpful for you.
Yeah, I think yoga really did, it enabled me to be with myself, because I was doing that even when I was still struggling. So that time just sort of spent on that. And I was just doing like yoga with Adrienne, who's very much about find what feels good, you know, get into your body. It wasn't...
But that's what's so important.
Yes.
Like that message, yoga is not about doing handstands. It's about find what feels good to you. And I don't think people get that.
No.
And like her classes might seem basic, but that's like the level 100 thing you have to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And it really built up confidence that I could stick at stuff. It really did, because like that was so my story for the longest time.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. And we've talked about it a lot of times on the podcast, haven't we? Where I feel like yoga was for me a complete game changer in how the story that I had about myself and the way that I could be accepting of myself and do things because of how they felt, not because of what I should do or what everyone else was doing or what the goal was. It's just, this is where I am, this is what I'm doing, and it feels right.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And there are facets of yoga where it's not like that, where it is that sense of competitiveness and what you can do. And like there was a lot of talk about food purity and stuff on my yoga teacher training, which I didn't really like. I didn't find it particularly helpful. So it can also be a world that it could exacerbate an eating disorder depending on the kind of spaces that you're in.
Definitely depends on the kind of teachers that you surround yourself with. And I think as well, if you have enough self-awareness, I know you talked on your episode of being able to kind of tune in and tune out of the bits that you found helpful, or be able to say, I respect that opinion, but I don't buy into it. That's really important as well.
Yeah. And I would never have been able to have done that 6, 7, 8 years ago. Because I was always looking for somebody who had the answers for me. And I see that now because people look to me and expect me to have the answers for them because I talk about this stuff all the time. And that was me. I'd be looking for somebody, become kind of a bit obsessed with their work and their message. And then they would say something that I'd be like, oh, that's bang off. And like, just discard them.
Yeah.
Like looking for a new person to kind of hook onto and follow what they're saying. And so now I really can just like pull out what's useful and go like, they're human. And yeah, I've said things in the past that I don't even necessarily agree with now as my thinking has evolved.
But that's always a great sign of growth, isn't it? Like you always want to be able to to look back over the past couple of years and be like, oh wow, like the way I think and I feel about a lot of different things has changed. It shows that growth that you're having. But you do see this. You see a lot of people who, especially on our content. So like our content will encourage people to track calories if they want to lose weight, and sometimes we'll suggest certain things like that, and we'll get comments like, this is so triggering for anyone who's got X, and we're like, yeah, but our message isn't for you know what I mean? In that sense, it's for people who are like, hey, like we're going to use something like tracking food as a tool for a set period of time, and then to raise levels of awareness and some education, and then take a step away from it. It's like it's not a forever thing, but there is that culture or anti-diet culture where it's like, we should never track food, we should never do this. There's so many like black and white sort of mentality around a lot of things. And I'm like, it's just not that. It isn't that black and white. It's just very different for a lot of different people. And it is always about finding, what works for you at that moment and stage in your life as well.
Yeah, and if I'm being completely honest, if you'd asked me to come on this podcast 18 months ago, I probably would have said no. Because I used to have this stance where I was like, I'm not going on any podcast where they talk about weight loss. Because I'd really, again, like, there was still like that little bit of black and white thinking there. But I've softened my stance a bit in this idea that in the anti-diet world, it's kind of assumed that any pursuit of weight loss is pathological. You guys would just be like swept off as like orthorexic. And like, honestly, like it gets really, and it's like there isn't really a place for me because I'm kind of in this nuanced way and I don't quite fit in with the fitness world and I don't fit in with the anti-diet people anymore. They're coming at me because we did an episode about the anti-diet identity and how it can actually be problematic. And Caroline Dooner, who wrote the Fuck It Diet, she wrote about recently, she put a post up where she said, I used to think that all attempts to lose weight is bad. She said, but actually I think the goal is to stop becoming obsessed with dieting and then stop becoming obsessed with not dieting. Because people will find that even sometimes ordering a salad feels triggering, and they're panicking about whether it's restriction or whether it's this, and is it okay to like factor in what I might know about nutrition when I'm trying to decide what to eat, or should I always be going with what I feel? People are confused. They're really confused because we're missing the middle ground.
Which hopefully is what we aim to do, right? We aim to help people find that middle ground and understand nutrition, but also understand life's for living. Like, you're not here to be eating chicken and broccoli and weight loss at all costs. It is, what's your lifestyle? What are your goals? How do we match the two and make this as enjoyable as it can be and get it done, and then focus on the rest of your life being intuitive eating, having a nice relationship with food, seeing like family occasions as things to look forward to, not to be scared of. That's our goal with our clients.
Yeah, which is always like difficult because we get that pushback from like the sort of the anti-diet crowd or anti-weight loss, like we're doing something wrong. And then, you know, you read our reviews or you see our testimonials of clients and it's like weight loss was a positive side effect of me getting my shit together. Weight loss was a positive side effect of me feeling like I have freedom again. Like this isn't consuming all my thoughts because, you know, being 40 pounds or 50 pounds overweight was triggering for me. I didn't feel good. I didn't have energy. I didn't feel as attractive as I wanted to. So getting to that place where it's like, I have kind of put that to bed. That was a season and I've learned these skills. It's like, I can go and focus on the rest of my life. You know, it's like, and it's putting that time in to get there. But yeah, like, again, it's horses for courses, and I think that's where that self-awareness has got to come in as well. Like, hey, like I can look at what a lot of people do. I can look at things that I really don't agree with, but can see like, oh, they're doing something quite clever there, and take 10% from it, and just have that sort of open mindset to be like, you don't have to agree with what everyone is doing. For me, and I guess that's maybe where people don't like. It's only if like you're hurting or harming people, and I think sometimes people can look at what we do and think, well, we are harming people because we're telling people to, you know, not telling people what we're trying to assist some people or help people lose weight and successfully keep it off.
This is the difficulty, I think, when you're speaking to a lot of people, because there will always be someone who's harmed by any message. So there will be people who will be harmed even by nuance, because they're not in a nuanced mind frame. So they'll hear something you say, they'll apply it in a black and white way, and, you know, end up causing more problems for themselves. Likewise with the whole anti-diet thing. You know, they can take anything that someone says, take it to this extreme and not be able to come back and find themselves. So it's something I think about a lot, because it's really hard when people send me questions, and some of them it's like, well, I could say this to one person and that would help them, and I could say the same thing to a different person and that could harm them. And screwed, really.
That's the beauty of like one-to-one work though, because you can gauge the person. But when you're talking on social media to a million people, you've got to try and find that middle ground, and it's not easy, is it?
It's certainly not easy, because it's like you said, like one thing can be beneficial to one person and harmful to another. But I think that's where you've just got to really be like true to your message and like understand what you're doing and who you help, and just sort of double down on that, because you can't appease everyone. Like you never can, and it's always going to get some sort of backlash. But as long as you feel like what you're doing is true to you and true to the, you know, putting some positivity back out there and helping people in what you believe to be a positive way, I think that is ultimately what matters.
Yeah, and there's I don't know if you've heard of Janine Roth. Do you know Janine Roth? She writes a lot about women and their relationship with food, and she identifies these two categories as the restrictors and the permitters. So the restrictors are the ones who are like, I want the food plan. Like, I can't be trusted to make any of these decisions. Put me in a cage because that's how I feel safe. And they will sometimes still binge, and that'll just confirm to them that they can't be trusted, and they just want to get back in their cage and structure as fast as possible. And then you've got the permitters, who are much more permissive around food. They've got a lot of guilt around food, but they're not trying to stop themselves from eating this, but they're in this sort of compulsive eating cycle. And she says, you know, these two things are kind of, actually, no, I say this about it, that these two like positions are like about control. So for the restrictor, the biggest existential fear is being out of control. But for the permitter, the existential fear is being controlled. So this is why with the podcast that I do with Steph, quick plug, but Steph's on the restrictor side of things and I was always on the permitter side of things. So we're coming at things from two different angles, and I'll say something and she'll be like, no, that's not how I would see it. And we're not actually necessarily, we always find this sort of strange middle place where we do agree, but we start off out here and we come in like that. And like that, I hope
that's us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That I hope then speaks to more people to have that, rather than just having two people who are just agreeing with each other constantly and on the same page. That's not going to resonate with everybody.
Because you did say in your email about the importance, or you really recognise the challenge of self-sabotage and rebellion, And I was like, I am so glad you brought this up, because that is 100% me. Like, if I decide I'm going to be on a diet, or like, if I decide I'm going to do anything, basically, I just won't.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas Jaymie will be like, I have this goal, I'm going to hit that goal. And that means today I'm going to do this and tomorrow I'm going to do that. And he will do every single thing on that list. But it is really
sometimes.
interesting.
I'm not that perfect.
You're pretty driven.
Yeah, I can be pretty driven. Yeah.
Does it ever frustrate you when you see people you're like, gosh, it would just be so much easier for you if you could just do this thing?
I think I used to think like that. Yeah, probably I started doing therapy like a year ago, and that definitely gave me it's definitely, I think I'm quite empathetic anyway, but it's gave me even more sort of empathy in terms of like levels of frustration. But yeah, in the past, I definitely used to think like that. But no, I just think everyone's going through their own battles and struggles, and it's at different places in life. So I try not to ever judge a book by its cover in that sense, and just try and understand people a little bit more before maybe making a judgment or giving advice, because I think that's the best way of sort of going about it. But then I also understand like a lot of my internal drivers to be like that are sometimes not the healthiest either.
It's double-edged sword with anything, isn't it?
Of course, yeah. Like there's definitely a feeling for me of like consistently not feeling like enough. So there's always a point to prove myself, so that I'm always trying to over-deliver and over-perform because of that. I've got a healthier place with that for sure, but like but I also sometimes I'm like, oh, but I like it because it drives me, it pushes me, it keeps me going, it pushes me for the next thing and the next thing. So again, I think a great quote that somebody told me is like, you can't hate someone and understand them at the same time. But I think you can kind of just put that to a lot of things. Like when you truly understand someone's behavior, you can have so much more empathy and compassion for how they're acting and behaving.
Yeah.
And just to bring that back in a loop, I guess, about the self-compassion we were talking earlier, self-sabotage is something that I can definitely relate to. I've had so many clients who've said to me, but why am I doing this? And I don't want to, and I want to reach my goal, or I want to achieve this. Why am I doing it? And I'm like, I don't know, because I do it too. Do you know?
Well, I bring it back to parts, right? Because it's this idea that you don't need willpower unless there's a conflict of will. So if every part of you is on board with, I don't know, going to a yoga class, you're just going to go. There's going to be no resistance there. If you find yourself struggling to do whatever the thing is, there's part of you that maybe feels controlled, maybe who knows what it might be, but it's trying to understand that part. It's like when someone struggles with binge eating, there is a part of you that wants to binge. And everyone's like, I want to destroy that part. I need to get rid of her or him or them, and I need them gone because I hate that part. But that is a part of you. Whether it's split off, however you might think of it, that's often a bit of a splitting sense where people are like, I feel like a completely different person when I'm behind closed doors or when I'm with my food or in this situation or that situation. We split off these parts we don't like. And actually, like, if we listen to those parts and try and bring them in, they normally calm the F down.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they don't seem to make sense, you're just like, okay, I know that you're scared of this. It doesn't make sense to me, but you are. And it's that way that we speak to ourselves in that. So again, it's not for everybody, but sometimes I find journaling in those moments when I'm feeling a sense of like agitation or just discomfort. And I tend to notice it because I'll be picking my phone up a lot or something like that. I'm like, what's this all about, Sarah? Like, you're really struggling just to be or distracted in some way. I'll just get that page out and I will just do like a stream of consciousness and the stuff that comes out. Thank goodness for digital notebooks that you can now password protect. In the old days, I was writing on bits of paper and then ripping them up and throwing them away. So I'm like, don't want anyone to ever see this. And now you can have that kind of privacy. But it comes from a willingness, I think, to accept the parts that we don't like, because then we can actually manage them. It's not about... Sorry.
Do you think self-sabotage often comes from a lack of self-worth?
It can do. I think that could be part of it, but it could just be another kind of conflict. I don't know if it always has to be self-worth, but it can be. If that part of you that believes that there's something really wrong with you, you're just broken in some way, you're never going to get any better, if that part is active, trying to take any action that you feel like might make you feel better or help you grow as a person is going to struggle to be able to come through. So yeah, I think that can certainly be part of it too.
We do a lot of work with clients on identity for that reason, because if you still identify as the person who always fails, the person who is broken, that's where your mind wants to keep you, because that's safe, that's known, that's where you are, right? So by truly believing you can create a new identity and moving towards that identity with each action you take is really powerful, we found.
Well, I think you want to build up the thing that you want. So if you have an eating disorder, for example, like that's a part of you. But when it's really active and it takes over, it gets so big that all the other parts of you have to become smaller to make space for this. So sometimes like that's how I would think about what you're talking about there. It's putting more energy into the parts of you that you want to be more active, but recognizing that there might always be a part of you that feels deficient in some way, that doesn't feel good enough. And if we can accept that that part is just there, maybe it's a part of being human. I don't know if everyone's got it. I think a lot of people have it. Then we can kind of go like, oh yeah, it's that part that's feeling activated. Because when it feels activated, it feels like it's us. We feel like we're just realizing, oh crap, we're not actually good enough, as opposed to, oh, that part of me that doesn't feel good enough, is there.
Yeah. I think it's not the same, but it's very similar to the concept of the chimp paradox, where you recognize there's another voice in your head, as it were. It's not the same, but I found that really helpful. I've got a lot of clients that have found that helpful to then have compassion for themselves and realize, okay, that voice might be there, but I don't have to listen to it. I can like respond to it and give it what it needs and make it feel safe and whatever it needs, but it doesn't have to dictate what I do as a person.
Mm-hmm. And compassion can be fierce as well. And I think this is what people don't always think of. When they think of compassion, they think of gentle and nurturing. But I think there's two types of critical voices that we have, and we might have more of one than the other. We've got the introjected critical voice. That's the messages we hear from our culture or our family that we then believe, like, you should be more like this, you should be more productive, you should eat like this, you should eat like that. Tends to be more introjected stuff that we've heard. And then we have the concluder, which is the stuff we conclude about ourselves. So it could be that, I don't know, a child grows up, both parents work, so they're not around a lot, and they conclude, oh, it's because, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, that's why my parents are around, people are never around for me and all of that. I think the concluder, because it's normally a younger part of us, needs the gentle, nurturing compassion. But the introjected stuff, sometimes it needs the fierce compassion. It needs to kind of go like, no, I'm not listening to that. So some people that have a really brutal, critical voice in their head, it's just like when they notice it coming, it's like, no, we're not talking to ourselves like we said. We're not talking to ourselves like that anymore. And it can be stern. It can be like a stern, fair teacher as well. So, and this is a Kristen Neff concept, the fierce compassion and the, I don't know if she calls it nurturing compassion or something like that. But the two critical voices was something that I've been kind of thinking about and an idea I've been playing around with, that I think we have an introjector and a concluder and that they might need different things.
Yeah, I always think about parenting yourself, because if you have a kid, there are some things you have to tell them that they're not going to like, and you have to be firm, and you sometimes have to say it in a stern voice, but you're doing it from a place of love and you're doing it from wanting the best for them, and it is genuinely like compassionate in that way. But it doesn't have to be like, oh, please, would you please put that knife down, darling? I love you so much.
Some parents, to be fair.
Sometimes you really have to deliver it in a different way, but it can still have the same essence behind it.
Yes. I also think of like self-care like that. Self-care is actually self-parenting.
Yes.
Because people think self-care is just about doing nice things for yourself, having a bubble bath and like doing this, whatever it might be. But it's actually how you might look after a child that you really loved.
Self-care is self-parenting,
100%,
because it's the things like going to bed on time, putting your phone down an hour before, making sure you floss, like all the boring shit. But like that's the kind of thing your parents would have nagged about, and they're not there to do it. So you got to do it.
Yes. But finding a voice that works for you. Because if you try and recreate your parents' voice, you're going to activate the rebel, probably. So for me, when I'm talking to myself, I'll talk to myself in the third person. It's one of my, so I'll say Sarah and I'll say you. So it might be, I don't know, this doesn't happen very often. I'm usually quite good with my phone and bedtimes. But there has been the odd time where I've got lost in something on my phone and I've realised like 40 minutes have gone by and I've been scrolling or something. And I'll just go, Sarah, put the phone down. And I'll say, Sarah, put the phone down. Come on. Time to go to bed. Come on, Sarah. And to be fair, I kind of sound more like I'm talking to a pet. But that's how I'll talk to myself sometimes. And I'll go,
so your mum didn't speak to you like that? Okay.
No. Yeah.
Not that I remember.
One of the things that we do have on this podcast is we always ask people like what they would like to cut the BS on. So obviously you're in the binge eating world. What are things that you typically do see on socials or just in general what you would love to cut the BS on?
I think the idea that it's about willpower and that it's about discipline And I think that particularly for people who are rational behaviorists around food, they'll look at people who seem to be making themselves miserable with this problem and think, and people have often partners and family that talk to them like this. They're like, if you're so unhappy, why don't you just stop doing it? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And it's this sort of very rational approach to something that doesn't feel rational. And that I think is the most corrosive message, because a lot of the time people who are struggling with binge eating, they believe this too. It's not just everybody else that's believing this. We're talking about a very primal drive that's become dysregulated for whatever reason that might be. And that's powerful stuff. And so the more people try and just fight back against it and try and build up this more willpower, this discipline, and the harder they are on themselves, the more they're burying themselves into a hole. So that, for me, is that it's not about willpower. It's not about discipline.
It's what they need to do, isn't it? So it's like what people are saying. It's what they need to do. It's just crap advice. It's like going to someone, oh yeah, you need to lose weight or just eat less.
Yeah.
It's just like, well,
cheers.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't keep the foods in the house.
Yeah.
That's the other one.
Yeah.
Why don't you just have a little bit of what you fancy? Everything in moderation.
Yeah. Or it's just like going to an alcoholic. Yeah, you should stop drinking. No shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, oh, you should just drink a lot less, or just don't go to the pub. You know what I mean? It's very easy. It's like what they need to do to an extent, but it's not practical, actionable advice that they can actually go and take on. It's like, oh yeah, just be more disciplined. You know, you'll be able to do it.
And for the longest time, I thought the reason why I wasn't recovering was because I wasn't trying hard enough. And I look back now at how hard I was trying. Like every single day I was battling this. And I really believed that I couldn't be trying hard enough. And so the efforts of just trying to try harder and all of that was what was just kind of making everything worse. So if anybody like listening relates to even struggling with binge eating, like there it is. And also that people didn't bring this on themselves. They didn't choose it. People think, oh, it's because I'm greedy or it's because I'm this. And this is how people will talk to themselves. And I'll say to them, would you choose this for yourself? Would you choose this for yourself? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, then how was it choice? Like, how was it your fault if this isn't something you would have chosen for yourself?
Yeah, and you do hear very, very often that becomes internalized as a judgment of themselves, that I must be a bad person. If I keep doing this to my body, I shouldn't be doing this to my body. And yeah, it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is.
So if somebody is listening and they have thought, okay, I really struggle with some of the concepts that have been brought up today, but I don't think I've got binge eating disorder. I just maybe am on the edge of like needing to get in a better relationship with food. What would your maybe like 3 top pieces of advice be?
I guess firstly, pay attention to the self-talk, to the way that you're talking to yourself around food, because if the way that you're speaking to yourself doesn't change, like nothing's going to change. So it's like, I'll always say that people try to change the way they eat by trying to change the way they eat. Like that's the whole methodology.
Yeah.
And it's like it's recognizing that doesn't work. I think the first thing is the acknowledgement that doesn't work and going like, okay, like I need to understand something better. So really inviting people to be more present around food as well would be my second piece of advice, because if we're not present with what's going on, we're just going unconscious over and over again. That doesn't have to look like some kind of structured mindful eating, because people will go, exactly, the all or nothing thinkers will go one way or another. It's like, okay, well, if I eat really mindfully, I can't binge. And then they set themselves this really unrealistic expectation of eating everything with 0 distractions and all of this. So asking yourself the question, how could you be 10 or 20% more present with food? And then I guess...
So just to give some practical examples, what might that look like for people?
So that could look like maybe 1 meal a day you have without distractions. Or it could look like, let's say you have so much judgment going on when you eat. It could be listening to a podcast, maybe yours, while you're eating. Therefore, you're looking at your food. So you're having the visual experience of eating and your food disappearing. But you've got something for your mind
rather
to be able to
watching
hold on
TV
to.
or scrolling.
Or watching your phone.
Yes.
But it's for some people, like it can feel like agony to just be sat in their own thoughts when they're eating. So this is like kind of, again, like a nice little middle ground. Or it could be that you just, maybe you eat the first quarter of your meal before you pick up your phone. You don't have to eat the whole thing. It's
crazy,
like
isn't it? Like we just don't know how to be bored anymore. You know what I mean? It's just like the phone has just become for Americans, the adult pacifier or the adult dummy, isn't it? It's just like any time there's a moment of like, oh, we've got nothing to do, we must go on our phone, or we must go on social media, or we must be distracted in some way. Yeah. Like we have really forgot to just be able to be with ourselves and be present.
The podcast one's a really good one for me, I find, because I struggle to do any one thing like at once unless it's like work that needs my full brain. I need to do two things. And I find that's a great middle ground where I can still concentrate on what I'm doing. And then there's like, I can tune out audio if I need to focus on what I'm doing, whereas visual is a bit more demanding from you, isn't it?
Yeah. And I love talking about boredom, because to me, boredom is really existential. It's what happens when it's just you with you and nothing else to hook onto or identify with. So when people say that they eat because they're bored, you know, you can either try to never be bored, and that's often what people attempt to do, or like deliberately be bored. Learn how to be bored, how to tolerate boredom. Because it can be really scary and anxiety producing for people as well. And sometimes if I'm doing a long car journey, I'll be like, right, I'm not going to listen to anything for 2 hours. And I feel the tension even before I've set off. And I'm like, well, the fact that this feels hard. I don't know if someone's like a challenge or something. I don't know.
I get that though.
It's like the Sarah version of your ice showers.
Yeah, I'll go for like intentionally go for walks. So I just like not like I used to always put something on. So and sometimes it's just actually great to just be able to just process the day or the morning or whatever's happened and just actually give your mind some time to just think. But yeah, it's there's a few things off like Andrew Huberman with that where it's like it's good to not use your headphones for like one workout a month just to kind of just like reset. So it's just like if you do always listen to something when you go for a walk or do something or you're always distracted, then it just becomes the norm. And if you ever don't have it, you feel worse. So actually doing a couple of times of not having it, being a bit present can really help. And then when you do it, you enjoy it more.
It would actually be my third piece of advice is to spend some time with yourself. Like without major distractions. So what I mean is without something that you will lose yourself in, like a television show or like scrolling or something like that. So it could be an activity. It doesn't have to be...
Like colouring. I love colouring for that.
Yeah, something, absolutely. Like lovely. Even like listening to some music potentially as well, like without doing anything else and just going for a stroll or whatever it might be. But finding ways, because if we cannot get comfortable in our own minds, we're always going to be searching for ways to escape it. And if food has become one of the go-tos, when you don't want to be in your own mind, your brain's going to go, eat. Why don't you just eat something? You don't have to feel like this if you just eat.
Yeah. Which sounds so rational.
And I guess getting support as well, like listening to stories of other people out there as well, I think is enormously helpful. Joining communities is enormously helpful. I have one. And yeah, connecting with others. Because even... there have been so many times where I've just heard another person's story or another person's experience, and that's made me feel less alone about something. It doesn't even have to be that like back and forth interaction if that's not what you want to do.
Yeah, amazing. So you did just mention about your community. If anybody wants to find out more about your work and you, where should they go searching?
So you can look at the podcast and Life After Diet. So the community is centered around the podcast, and we look at the question, if we're not dieting, now what? Because there's a lot of talk out there about diets don't work, but what are we actually doing instead? I have a YouTube channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I also run therapy groups and workshops. You can go to my website, thebingeeatingtherapist.com, to find out more about that or to say hi.
Amazing. Thank you so much for making the journey. I know it's been quite a trek for you up here today, so we definitely appreciate it. And it's been a really enjoyable episode.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Stacey. Thanks, Jamie.
If you've been listening to the Body Smart podcast, you will know we are passionate about helping women not just lose weight, but have the knowledge, skills, and habits to make sure that they can keep that weight off for the rest of their lives. So if you are interested in finding out more about our one-to-one coaching, go over and click the link in the bio.